Sunlight spilled over the hills of Crete, the warm glow catching in golden ripples across the surface of the Aegean Sea. The morning light painted the land with a gentle brilliance, revealing the stone-paved paths that led to bustling markets and the laughter of a civilization at the height of its glory. The scent of olive oil, freshly ground spices, and salt from the sea mingled in the air, a fragrant symphony that told of prosperity and abundance. Life thrummed through the heart of the Minoans, and everything seemed touched with magic. Knossos, the grandest of the Minoan cities, was a wonder of artistry and power. Its palace, a labyrinthine marvel of interconnected rooms and courtyards, stood like a living testament to human ingenuity and the blessings of the gods. Bright, vivid frescoes adorned its walls, breathing with motion and life, dolphins leaping in clear blue waves, young athletes bending and twisting in bull-leaping ceremonies, and flowers so meticulously painted they seemed to sway in an imagined breeze. The air buzzed with energy, voices rising in cheerful chatter as merchants shouted their wares, and bronzesmiths hammered metal into exquisite shapes that would soon adorn the elite. Young children played in the shadow of these palatial walls, their laughter ringing out like music. Priests and priestesses, draped in intricate robes and heavy gold jewelry, moved among the people with a serene authority, blessing the harvest and offering prayers to a great goddess who watched over them all. Women held a place of immense reverence here, respected as leaders and healers, artists and caretakers of sacred rituals. Minoan art, splashed with life and vibrant color, depicted these women in powerful stances, often leading ceremonies or communing with the divine. Beyond the markets, Phaistos lay to the south, a city less grand than Knossos but equally alive. Its streets were lined with stone homes, each bustling with activity, potters shaping clay on spinning wheels, weavers pulling thread through their looms to make bright and patterned fabrics, and farmers gathering olives and grain to feed their people. A sweet, earthy smell lingered in the air. Shepherds led their flocks across lush hillsides, and farmers spoke of fruitful harvests as they prepared their fields under a generous sun. The Minoans' mastery of agriculture and their trade networks made sure everyone prospered, and they knew it. They carried themselves with a quiet pride, eyes always open to the horizon. Ships painted with colorful prows dotted the coast, the lifeblood of Minoan wealth and influence. These ships, strong and swift, cut through the waters of the Aegean like knives, trading goods with far-off lands. They carried Cretan wine, honey, olive oil, and exquisite pottery glazed with scenes of nature, birds, fish, wildflowers, and sacred bulls. Their sails spread wide, whispering stories of adventure, diplomacy, and wealth. Minoan sailors spoke of distant lands where the language was strange, and the gods wore unfamiliar faces. But they also brought home stories of the sea, of shimmering creatures glimpsed beneath the waves, of calm blue horizons that turned to tempestuous storms without warning, and of a deep, ancient force within the waters that always seemed to be watching. Akrotiri, a jewel on the island of Thera to the north, pulsed with vibrant life. Streets wove between homes adorned with murals of saffron gatherers and fishermen, their walls whispering of a society both wealthy and beautiful. Its markets overflowed with traders bartering in strange tongues, and the wharves were a constant hum of activity, with baskets of fish and precious saffron flowers brought in by strong, weathered hands. But there was always something serene about Akrotiri. Perhaps it was the rhythmic sound of the waves, or the way the afternoon light kissed the volcanic cliffs, as if the gods themselves had blessed the land. In every city, the Minoans paid tribute to their gods, living in harmony with an unseen world they believed was always present, just beneath the surface. Shrines dotted the countryside and the heart of every palace. Offerings of barley, honey, and beautiful crafted figurines lay at the feet of sacred altars, where people prayed for good harvests and safe returns for their loved ones at sea. The beating heart of their religion was a connection to nature, the belief that the divine whispered through the rustle of olive leaves and danced in the shadows of the great mountain peaks. Yet not everything was peaceful. Underneath the beauty and vibrance, there were whispers, almost imperceptible, of unease. Old fishermen told tales of tremors felt beneath the earth, a shifting they claimed came from an angered sea god or something even older. Those with eyes for the patterns of nature spoke of changes in the wind or the behavior of the animals. Cretan bees swarmed with strange urgency, and sometimes the sea turned restless for no reason. Still, life went on as it always had, with only small moments of pause for fear. For now, the land of Crete and the civilization that bloomed on it seemed unbreakable, as if time itself could never wear it down. The Minoans danced in their temples and worked in their fields, confident in the bounty of their land and the protection of their deities. Bronze daggers gleamed on the belts of warriors, but they were rarely drawn, for war had become a distant, forgotten echo, something to be found in foreign lands, but not here, not on their blessed island. There was always more to build, more to celebrate, more to give thanks for. The Minoans' art and architecture did more than record history. It captured the soul of a people who loved life, who believed every moment had meaning. The frescoes, the pottery, and the great palaces told stories of joy and worship, of human strength and divine favor. Their hands created wonders, and the world seemed to smile in return. Yet, for all their brilliance, the Minoans were mortal, and their world, like all mortal things, stood balanced between light and shadow. The very sea that fed them and connected them to far-off lands could turn hungry in a heartbeat, and the mountains that gave them strength harbored ancient powers both protective and capricious. Perhaps they sensed it, that fragile thread that tied them to their gods, but if so, it did not stop them from laughing, loving, and building as if the world would never end. The courtyard of Knossos pulsed with life, a scene so rich and vibrant it seemed almost unreal, like a story that had slipped free from the hands of a bard. The scent of fresh bread, baked in clay ovens, mingled with the sweet perfume of wildflowers woven into crowns by young girls laughing under the midday sun. Somewhere in the distance, the faint, rhythmic beat of a drum called out, echoing through the maze of rooms and corridors that made up this magnificent palace. It was a rhythm that spoke of tradition, of rituals older than the walls themselves. The palace of Knossos stood as a living giant, an architectural wonder that wrapped around the senses and pulled you into its spell. It was not a single building, but a labyrinth of interconnected rooms, storerooms, grand staircases, and open courtyards. Sunlight streamed through the intricate wooden frames of windows, pooling on the polished stone floors. Carved columns, painted a deep red and crowned with black, rose up like guardians of a bygone era, whispering tales of festivals, ceremonies, and feasts. Color lived in every corner. Frescoes danced along the walls, their colors so brilliant it seemed they had captured the spirit of the land. There was the grace of blue dolphins leaping joyously through waves, a vision so full of life it was almost as if the creatures would swim off the walls and splash you with sea spray. There were images of women dressed in flowing robes, hair curled and bound with gold, their hands raised in sacred gestures. One fresco, startling in its intensity, depicted a bull-leaping ceremony, young athletes vaulting over the great horns of a massive bull, their limbs caught in a moment of perfect, impossible grace. Knossos was a place of ritual and worship. Life here was not just about survival, it was an intricate dance with the divine. Each morning, priests and priestesses would walk through the palace halls, their robes whispering against the stone. The priestesses, in particular, held a place of awe. They were the keepers of the sacred flame, the ones who carried the words of the gods, who could speak to the unseen. It was said that they could summon visions, that they held dreams like fragile glass in the palms of their hands. People bowed their heads in reverence as these women passed, sensing the power that clung to them, a quiet, almost sacred intensity. Life in Knossos was a complex web of power and ritual, held together by unseen threads. There was a clear order, a structure that shaped everything. At the top, the ruler of Knossos, the man or woman known as the king priest or priestess queen, ruled with the blessing of the gods. But power did not belong to one person alone. Wealthy nobles filled the palace with the glitter of gold and bronze, their power drawn from land, trade, and the blessings they offered to the divine. Merchants buzzed through the palace like honeybees, bringing in news and goods from across the Aegean. They traded in precious metals, pottery, oils, and saffron, which was worth its weight in gold. In the storerooms, great clay jars stood like silent sentinels, filled with oil, wine, and grain. The air inside those rooms was cool, scented with the musky aroma of storage and the knowledge that life depended on what lay hidden in those containers. Every pot was a promise that hunger would not come, that trade would flourish, that the gods had not turned their backs. Yet for all its beauty, Knossos was full of shadows, corners that the light never quite touched. There was a sense that something lay beneath the surface, and the very bones of the palace. The labyrinthine design, twisting and turning in impossible directions, whispered of myths, of a monster hidden in the dark. The Minotaur, half man, half bull, was said to haunt the endless hallways, trapped there by the power of a curse. It was just a story, told by mothers to frighten children into obedience, but even the strongest men walked a little faster when alone in the deeper halls. Fear had a way of lingering, like a shadow that wouldn't let go. Rituals punctuated the rhythm of daily life, tying the people together in sacred acts. Bull leaping, the most breathtaking of these, was an act of devotion as much as of skill. The bull was sacred, a symbol of strength and divine favor, and those who leapt over it became part of something eternal. Young men and women trained endlessly, their bodies honed to perfection, their minds sharp and focused. When the moment came, the great beast would charge, muscles rippling, horns low and ready. And with a final, almost defiant burst of courage, the leaper would take hold of the bull's horns, twisting upward, flying through the air as if gravity itself had ceased to exist. There was no room for hesitation, no space for fear. In that instant, time froze. The crowd would hold its breath, suspended between hope and terror. When the ceremony was over, when the bull and the leaper both stood unharmed, a great cheer would rise, and relief would flood the air. The gods had been appeased once more. Yet, no one could ignore the underlying fear. What would happen if one day the gods were no longer pleased? Markets outside the palace brimmed with activity. Farmers sold baskets of figs and grapes, while potters displayed vases decorated with scenes of myth and daily life. Women ground barley in the stone mills, their hands strong and practiced, talking about their families and dreams in quiet voices. Young boys ran errands for the merchants, slipping between people, laughing and teasing each other. Life flowed through Knossos like a river, vibrant and unstoppable. The economy thrived on this movement. Bronze weapons and tools, crafted with extraordinary skill, were highly prized. Minoan traders sailed far and wide, bringing back not just goods but stories, weaving Crete into a complex web of alliances and promises. The palace's storerooms never stayed empty for long, the people worked tirelessly, and the sea routes hummed with the passage of ships. Yet, not all stories spoke of prosperity. There were tales of priests who had gone mad, of visions of fire and ash, of voices that spoke from beneath the ground. The priests, with their shaved heads and dark eyes, were both revered and feared. They performed rituals that no one else was allowed to see, rituals that kept the balance between mortals and gods. People spoke of sacrifices made in the dead of night, whispered offerings carried to shrines hidden away from the world. Life in Knossos was a tapestry of beauty and power, threaded with awe and just a touch of fear. The palace walls held laughter and sorrow, faith and doubt, and the knowledge that nothing, not even a civilization this grand, could last forever. The wind swept over the island, carrying with it the voices of the past, whispers that threaded through the olive groves and climbed the ancient stone temples. People said the land of Crete was more than rock and soil. It breathed. It listened. And it was never far from the divine. Under a sky so vast it seemed to touch the edges of forever, the Minoans had built their world in worship of a great goddess, whose power pulsed in the earth and flowed through their blood. This was a place where the line between mortal and God blurred, where the sacred was stitched into the fabric of everyday life. In the heart of a darkened grove, where sunlight barely pierced the canopy of trees, a priestess knelt before a simple altar carved from stone. Her hair fell in thick, glossy curls down her back, adorned with strands of gold and fragrant myrtle leaves. Her hands trembled as she placed a fresh offering of barley and honey onto the altar. Her lips moved in a silent prayer, one she had whispered countless times, but tonight it felt heavier, more urgent. The forest seemed to breathe around her, leaves rustling with secrets that could not be spoken aloud. Something was coming, even the earth felt it. The Minoans lived their days under the gaze of their great goddess, a deity who held dominion over life and death, fertility and destruction. Her spirit was said to flow through the rivers, dance in the flames of sacred fires, and rest in the shadows of the mountains that towered over the land. Statues carved from stone or molded from clay depicted her with serene yet all-seeing eyes, holding serpents in her hands or crowned with symbols of nature's power. She was both mother and warrior, life-giver and destroyer. People came to her temples carrying their deepest fears and greatest hopes, trusting that she would keep the balance between chaos and order. It was not only the great goddess who held sway over the Minoans. Bulls were sacred, creatures of immense power that seemed to carry the earth's heartbeat in their heavy hooves. Bull leaping was no mere sport, it was a ritual, an act of devotion. The ceremony was equal parts beauty and terror. In the grand courtyards of places like Knossos, the people gathered to watch, their breath tight in their chests. Young men and women, some barely more than children, stood in silence, facing a bull with horns that gleamed like polished bronze. The animal would paw at the ground, snorting, muscles tense with a force that could crush bones. And when it charged, there was a moment of suspended terror, as if the whole world had stopped to watch. The leapers moved with grace and bravery that seemed almost otherworldly. Their bodies flew over the bull's back, twisting and turning in feats that defied logic. It wasn't just skill or practice, it was something deeper, as if the gods themselves lifted them into the air, carrying them past the creature's deadly horns. The crowd would erupt in cries of awe and relief, but behind the cheering there was always the shadow of fear. Every ceremony was a reminder that the divine was wild, untamed, and that humans played at the edge of something far greater than themselves. Rituals wove through every part of Minoan life. The priestesses held the most sacred role, serving as intermediaries between the mortal world and the divine. They stood in the sacred caves and hilltop shrines where offerings were made, their voices lifting in hymns that made the very air tremble. Sacred fires burned, and the scent of offerings, fragrant myrrh, sweet wine, and sacrificial blood, filled the air. During great festivals, people would line the streets, carrying flowers and gifts, dancing until their feet were raw and their spirits soared, hoping to please the deities who watched from unseen places. And yet, there were myths that made the blood run cold, stories shared in hushed voices around the fires. The Minoans believed that the gods spoke through visions, through dreams that carried messages wrapped in riddles and half-truths. Once, long ago, a prophecy had been whispered into the ear of an old seer, a man with eyes clouded from age, but who saw clearer than any mortal. He had told of a future drenched in sorrow, a time when the earth itself would rise in anger. A force that slumbered beneath the waves would awaken, bringing fire and darkness. When the stars weep red and the sea howls, he had said, the land of plenty will become the land of ash. People tried to forget that prophecy, burying it beneath laughter and celebration, but on nights when the moon bled red into the sea, fear settled into their bones like a sickness. The priests said that disaster could be averted, that offerings could soothe even the angriest of gods, but doubts lingered, festering quietly. Was there truly a way to change fate, or was it already written in the stars? Some swore they had felt the earth tremble underfoot in recent days, a faint, unsettling quiver that made the olive trees shiver. Old fishermen, leathery from the sun, said the sea was changing, that waves now seemed restless, as if trying to speak. The priestesses, so calm and sure in their faith, were seen looking out at the horizon, their brows furrowed as if trying to hear something just out of reach. The feeling was inescapable, the world had shifted, and the balance that had held for so long now stood on the edge of a knife. But life went on, as it always did. Young couples still whispered promises in hidden groves, children still chased each other in fields of wildflowers, and farmers still planted seeds in rich, dark soil, trusting in the generosity of the land. Yet the sacred caves grew darker, the flames of temple fires flickered more fiercely, and the bull leapers practiced with a desperation that made their elders shake their heads. In the heart of Knossos, the great goddess watched over her people. Her eyes, painted onto temple walls, seemed almost to move, following the lives of her devoted children. Did she know what was to come? Did she hold the power to stop it, or was she, too, bound to fate, unable to change what had been set in motion? The answer lay somewhere in the pulse of the earth, in the heartbeat of the bulls, in the whispers carried on the wind. Something was coming, something that would test every ritual, every prayer, every ounce of faith. The Minoans could only hold on to their sacred mysteries, hoping that the gods they had worshipped so fiercely would not turn their backs when the sea finally rose to claim the land. The sea was a living thing, vast and full of moods, unpredictable as a god and powerful enough to swallow a man whole. To the Minoans, the waters of the Aegean weren't just waves and blue horizons, they were both friend and enemy, blessing and curse. A sudden breeze off the coast could mean fortune, pushing their ships laden with goods towards foreign lands, or it could spell disaster, dragging men down into the darkness. Crete was an island shaped by the sea, and every heartbeat of its civilization was tied to that restless, ever-changing expanse. The Minoans were masters of these waters. Their ships, carved from sturdy cedar and sleek with innovation, cut through the waves like graceful dolphins. Painted eyes adorned the prows, warding off evil and guiding sailors through the mists of early morning and the gold-streaked sunsets of evening. The scent of salt and sun-warmed wood clung to the sailors' skin, their muscles honed by the rhythm of rowing and the strain of sails catching the wind. They knew the sea like they knew their own souls, where the best fish swam, the safest harbors, and the secret paths of currents that could carry a ship home faster than prayers. Trade was their lifeblood, a network of routes connecting Crete to lands far beyond the horizon. They brought back tin from the mines of Anatolia, exotic spices from Egypt, and copper from Cyprus. In return, they gave the world beauty, pottery painted with flowing designs, knives of bronze honed to a sharp edge, and olive oil that shimmered like liquid sunlight. Their trade spread not just goods, but stories and customs, weaving cultures together in ways that were both miraculous and fragile. They spoke of distant gods, of festivals they'd witnessed, of strange foods and stranger people, drawing the world closer, one deal at a time. Yet, for all their mastery, the sea was not tamed. It had secrets, lurking deep below the waves, and the Minoans knew that power lay in those shadowed depths. Fishermen told of glimpses, shadows twisting through the turquoise waters, vanishing in a heartbeat. They spoke of shapes larger than ships, of eyes like lanterns peering up from the dark, waiting, watching. Even the bravest captains felt a shiver when navigating the deeper stretches, where the water turned from blue to black and the air grew heavy with something ancient and unspeakable. Stories drifted from port to port, whispered on the lips of sailors. They told of Thalassia, the sea mother, a goddess more capricious than the great goddess of the land. Her wrath could churn the ocean into a frenzy of foam and howling winds, but her smile could still the fiercest of storms. Sacrifices were made to her, wine poured into the waves, jewels cast overboard as offerings of gratitude or pleas for mercy. It was said that she sang, her voice drifting through the waves, sweet and sorrowful, calling sailors to their doom. No one truly knew her face, but her presence was undeniable, a force no one dared question. Yet there were more chilling tales, whispers of something else, something that even Thalassia feared. They called it Karkinos, the Great Devourer. Some said it was a monster born from the rage of an old, forgotten god, a creature of darkness and malice. It moved silently beneath the waves, massive claws capable of cracking ships like driftwood. Sailors who went missing in calm waters, who never returned, were said to have been taken by Karkinos. There were nights when the sea glowed an eerie green, and old men in the harbors would say it was the monster's breath, a sign that he prowled close to the surface, hungry. One quiet afternoon, a fisherman's son sat on the edge of a pier, the wooden boards warm against his legs. His father was out at sea, and he waited, watching the horizon where the sky kissed the waves. The boy loved the sea, it had always been a part of him. But today, a strange chill brushed the back of his neck, a cold breath that made him shiver even under the bright sun. He squinted, half convinced he saw a shadow out there, something that shouldn't be. But before he could be sure, it was gone, leaving only the rhythmic splash of the water against the stone pier. Men and women in the coastal villages began to notice other signs. Nets, once heavy with fish, came back empty, shredded as if by massive teeth. Some nights, the wind carried a low, groaning sound, almost like a voice, too deep and mournful to be human. One sailor swore he saw it, a glimpse of the monster from the deck of his ship, a silhouette so enormous it blotted out the moon. He returned home with wild eyes, trembling hands, and a heart that could not calm, whispering, Karkinos is awake. The sea began to feel less familiar, less welcoming, and more like something that held a grudge. Captains, once so fearless, started to perform more rituals, tying knots into ropes for protection and refusing to set sail without first praying at every shrine. Fishermen who had once laughed at the thought of monsters grew silent when the waves lapped too close, as if listening for the thing they could not name. Even the merchant lords in the palaces of Knossos grew restless. If the sea turned against them, if the great devourer truly prowled the waters, then all the wealth in the world could not save them. But trade must continue, and ships still left port every day, masts rising like spears against the sky. The Minoans were too entwined with the sea to abandon it, no matter how many shadows haunted its depths. Still, the air buzzed with tension, with the feeling that the old stories, the ones told to frighten children, might hold more truth than they had ever believed. The ocean had a heartbeat, one that pulsed with something more than tides. And as the people of Crete went about their days, they could not shake the sense that somewhere out there, in the deepest reaches of the Aegean, an ancient hunger was stirring, and it had set its gaze upon them. The first tremor came at dawn, soft as a whisper, barely enough to stir the olives on the trees. The people of Knossos hardly noticed, brushing it off as the island's restless nature, a gentle reminder that Crete rested on the back of something old and shifting. But there were some who felt it, an unease warming through their bones. Old women muttered prayers under their breath, and a shepherd in the hills paused, feeling the stones shift beneath his feet, sensing a warning wrapped in that small quake. Something was coming. They didn't know how soon, or how fierce, but the land itself seemed to be bracing for impact. Days passed, and then the ground roared. It wasn't a gentle whisper this time. It was a scream, a gut-wrenching roar that shattered pottery and cracked the stone walls of homes. People fell to their knees, hands covering their heads as the world around them crumbled. The grand palaces that had stood for generations, with their colorful frescoes and great halls, swayed like trees in a storm. In Knossos, a mother clutched her child, shielding him from the rain of falling debris. She could only pray, her heart pounding with the rhythm of the earth's fury, that the walls would hold. The earthquake seemed endless, a never-ending cacophony of collapsing stone and splintering wood. The ground bucked and heaved, splitting open like an old wound. Screams mingled with the groaning of buildings giving way, the sky thick with dust, choking, suffocating. When it finally stopped, silence fell, a silence so complete it felt wrong, a void filled only with the sobs of the survivors and the echo of the earth's rage. People staggered through the destruction, faces streaked with tears and dust, calling out for lost loved ones. The grand courts of the palaces lay shattered, their beauty marred by great fissures that cut through the once proud halls. But the earth was not done. Even as the people mourned, the sky darkened with ash, and a new terror awoke, fire, born from the mountains, sent to punish or cleanse. From the heart of Thera, a volcano far across the sea but close enough to be a menace, fire and smoke burst forth in an eruption so violent that it seemed the gods themselves were tearing the sky apart. The waters of the Aegean, usually a gentle blue, were whipped into frothy madness, as if the sea, too, feared what was happening. Ships anchored in harbors bobbed like toys, and fishermen ran for the safety of the shore, eyes wide with dread. Thera's eruption was no simple display of nature's might. It was a punishment, or so the priests claimed. The fire breathed into the sky turned day into night, an unholy darkness illuminated only by flashes of molten rock. Ash rained down, covering the world in a suffocating blanket, falling on crops, on homes, on the stunned, terrified faces of people who had never imagined such wrath. In the shadows of their crumbling temples, the faithful wailed and begged for mercy, convinced that their gods had turned against them. Families huddled together, trying to shield each other from the rain of ash, breathing through cloths soaked in vinegar, praying not to choke. The seers were sought out, those with eyes that could supposedly pierce the veil between the mortal world and the will of the divine. One old seer, blind but with pupils like milk, stood in the ruins of what had been a market, speaking words that chilled the air. He said the balance had been broken, that the gods were angry, that the land itself was rebelling. His voice trembled, but it was strong enough to cut through the grief and fear, delivering a message no one wanted to hear. This was only the beginning. The sea, the mountains, the very bones of Crete, everything was at war, and the cost would be great. Stories spread quickly, tales of fire-breathing gods and monsters of flame that danced on the edge of the world, reveling in the destruction. People remembered the old myths of Thera, of a god trapped within the mountain, burning with rage for centuries, finally freed to exact revenge. Survivors whispered of seeing shapes in the fire, great serpents or giants, their eyes glowing like embers, and when they slept, they dreamed of fire that never stopped, of the world being consumed. A fisherman, leathery and hard from years of sun and sea, sat by the shore, his hands shaking as he watched the ocean. He'd heard the old tales of how the sea would rise to claim the land one day, angry and unstoppable. The waves seemed restless now, rising higher, crashing harder. He thought he saw something in the distance, a line of darkness on the horizon, almost like a wall. A great wave, maybe, or maybe just the exhaustion playing tricks on his mind. But he couldn't shake the feeling that the sea was coming for them, that the anger of the earth had spilled over into the waters. In the temples, priestesses lit sacred fires, though the flames seemed feeble against the ash that drifted in through shattered windows. They offered sacrifices, pleading for peace, for forgiveness. The scent of burnt offerings filled the air, mingling with the sulphurous stench that clung to everything. One priestess, her hands blistered from tending the flames, whispered that she had seen a vision. A bull with eyes of flame, charging across a burning field. It was an omen, she said, but no one knew if it meant hope or doom. The people clung to whatever faith they could find, but fear was a poison, spreading faster than comfort. Children asked questions their parents couldn't answer, staring wide-eyed at the broken world around them. Was the earth angry at them? Would the gods ever be pleased again? But no one could answer, no one could promise safety or predict when the next tremor would come, or if the sea would rise to drown them all. All they had was the fragile hope that the ground would grow still, that the skies would clear, and that the gods, if they truly held sway over the land, would show mercy. But the earth beneath them felt alive, restless, wounded. And as the people of Crete picked up the pieces of their shattered world, they did so with the heavy knowledge that nature, their constant companion, had the power to turn on them at any moment. Every small quake that followed, every new rumble, sent a shudder of terror through the crowds, and even the bravest among them could not shake the feeling that Crete, the island they had loved and trusted, was now a land that could betray them in a heartbeat. The nightmares started long before the whispers. Children woke up screaming, soaked in sweat, describing a monster with eyes that burned like coals and horns sharp enough to tear the sky. In the market, old men clutched amulets and muttered about omens. Even the animals grew restless, the goats bleating mournfully at night, sensing something in the wind. It was a shadow, heavy and unseen, but felt in every breath and tremble of the earth. And always, it seemed to wear the shape of a bull. The bull had always been sacred to the Minoans, a creature of strength and virility, tied to the pulse of life itself. In the heart of the great palace of Knossos, frescoes painted in rich, unearthly colors depicted acrobats leaping over the backs of bulls, their bodies twisting in defiance of gravity. It was a dance of courage, a celebration of the divine. But now, those images seemed like echoes from a gentler time. The air in the palace felt thick, charged with something dark and unspeakable. People walked with their heads bowed, and even laughter sounded strained, an uneasy note in a symphony of fear. They whispered of the Minotaur, the beast born of rage and secrets, a punishment for sins no one could name aloud. Some said it was just a story, a symbol of the chaos spreading through their society, but others swore they had seen it. Seen the flash of horns in the shadows of the olive groves, seen eyes glowing red beneath the pale light of the moon. Mothers pulled their children closer, hearts pounding, as the rumors grew into something monstrous and uncontainable. Fear made even the smallest shadow seem dangerous, and in every dark corner, the people of Crete imagined the bull-headed beast watching, waiting. The bull cult, which had once been a celebration of life, grew more fervent. The rituals became louder, more frantic, with dancers moving like they were trying to outpace a growing dread. The priests, draped in crimson robes, spoke of the gods' anger and the need for greater sacrifices. The altars ran slick with blood, and people turned their eyes away, ashamed but desperate. Bulls were offered up with solemn prayers, their cries echoing through the stone courtyards, but it didn't feel like enough. The earthquakes didn't stop. The sky remained dark with ash. The fear didn't lessen. There was a day, bitter and cold despite the season, when a bull, offered for sacrifice, went wild. It broke free, its massive hooves pounding against the sacred stones, eyes wide with something close to madness. The priests shouted, trying to control it, but the beast was unstoppable, crashing through the crowd, tossing bodies aside like dry reeds. It was finally brought down, but the omen was clear. The balance between the gods and men was broken, and something terrible was now loose in the world. The older priests called for calm, but there were others, younger and more desperate, who whispered of a different path. They spoke in secret, gathering late at night in places where the shadows were deepest. They believed the gods could not be appeased with simple rituals anymore, that the world had crossed into a darkness that needed something stronger. These followers formed a secret society, meeting in the labyrinthine tunnels beneath the palace, where torches flickered and shadows danced on the walls like ancient spirits. They began to practice forbidden rites, old and forgotten prayers that spoke of blood and bones and bargains made in darkness. Their leader was a man named Makaros, tall and thin with a voice that could chill the heart. He spoke of visions, of a god with horns of flame, demanding sacrifices that no one dared to imagine. His eyes, bright and feverish, held the crowd of followers spellbound. He told them that only through these forbidden acts could Crete be saved, that only by facing the beast within could they hope to turn aside the anger of the gods. The desperation in the air was a poison, seeping into even the strongest hearts, and one by one, people fell under his sway. The first ritual took place in the dead of night, with only the stars to witness. The participants wore masks carved to resemble bulls, and their chants echoed through the tunnels, a sound that would have made even the bravest soul shudder. They made offerings of flesh, hands trembling but determined, praying that the gods would hear them, that the earthquakes would stop, that peace would return. But the earth remained silent, holding its breath, and in the shadows, it felt as though unseen eyes were watching. Some of the people began to notice changes. There was a madness creeping through the land, subtle but unmistakable. Men who had once been gentle turned violent, their tempers flaring like sparks from a fire. Children had strange dreams, waking in the night with images of labyrinths that twisted and stretched into eternity, always with the Minotaur waiting at the center. Even the animals seemed affected, with bulls becoming harder to tame, their wild eyes mirroring the growing chaos around them. In a small village, far from the palace, a young girl named Thalia woke up screaming. Her mother rushed to her side, trying to calm her, but Thalia's eyes were wide, unseeing. "The bull is hungry," she whispered, her voice cracked and strange. "He's coming." Her mother, frightened and exhausted, held her close, rocking her back and forth, but the girl would not be soothed. Outside, the wind picked up, howling through the cracks in the walls, and somewhere in the distance, a bull bellowed, a sound that sent a shiver through everyone who heard it. Even those who tried to hold onto their faith felt it slipping through their fingers. They had once believed in gods who protected the land, who danced with them in rituals of life and harvest. But now, it seemed those gods had turned their backs, or worse, had been replaced by something far more sinister. The shadow of the bull loomed over everything, a specter that tainted even the brightest of days. The Minotaur had become more than a myth. It was fear given form, chaos given a name. The labyrinth wasn't just a place beneath the palace anymore. It was the minds of the people, twisted and lost, trapped in an endless maze of dread. Each step they took led them deeper into a world that felt increasingly unrecognizable. And somewhere, deep in that labyrinth of fear and sacrifice, the bull waited, as it always had, as it always would, ready to claim what was owed. The tale of Atlantis was not just a story. It was a shadow draped over every Minoan heart, a warning echoing from the past. Old fishermen would speak of it in hushed voices as they mended their nets by the sea, their eyes growing distant as though they could almost see the lost city beneath the waves. They described a land so beautiful it hurt to think of, with golden temples and gardens overflowing with life, swallowed whole by the hungry sea in a single, terrible night. Mothers whispered the story to restless children, reminding them to never anger the gods, for they remembered how even the proudest civilization could be erased in a heartbeat. It was the priestess Althea who felt the curse of Atlantis most keenly. Her dreams were haunted by visions of a city glistening under the sun, its people laughing and dancing with a joy that seemed almost otherworldly. But then, always, the laughter would stop. The sky would darken, the earth would shatter, and waves taller than mountains would rush in, swallowing everything. She would wake in her chamber drenched in sweat, the echo of the crashing sea still thundering in her ears. Althea knew these were not dreams born of fear alone. They were warnings, messages sent from the gods themselves. And the gods, she had learned, did not speak in vain. One morning, she stood before the council in the great hall of Knossos, her face pale but her voice steady. Her white robes, embroidered with symbols of protection, seemed almost too light for the weight of the words she carried. The council members listened, but she could feel the tension in the air, a silent disbelief mingled with dread. The frescoes on the walls, once symbols of power and prosperity, felt like mocking reminders of what they had to lose. Althea described the visions, the earth splitting open, the ocean roaring forward, and the screams of people who had thought themselves safe. Atlantis fell, she said, her voice breaking only for a moment. A land blessed with beauty, strength, and wisdom, just like ours. The gods will not spare us if we continue on this path of defiance and fear. Her words echoed in the hall, but there were those who would not hear them. Lord Nikaros, one of the wealthiest and most influential men in Crete, sneered. His hands, adorned with golden rings, clenched in impatience. Stories, he spat, nothing more than tales to frighten children. Atlantis is a myth, not a prophecy. Others murmured their agreement, relief blooming in their eyes. They wanted to believe Nikaros, wanted to hold onto the life they had built, a life of marble and painted dreams. But the believers, those who felt the truth in Althea's words, grew pale. They had seen the signs too, the restlessness of the sea, the tremors that shook the ground, the unsettling omens whispered by the wind. They knew that the gods' anger could not be silenced with gold or denial. Outside the palace walls, the people were divided, just like the council. Some clung to the promise that everything would be fine, that the ground would stop shaking, that the sea would never rise to claim them. But others began to prepare, digging cellars, hiding their wealth, making offerings in secret to gods both remembered and half forgotten. The city that had once pulsed with life now thrummed with fear, and in every conversation, Atlantis lingered like a curse no one could shake. Althea walked through the crowded streets, feeling the desperation of her people. A child ran past her, chasing a stray goat, and she caught a glimpse of something bright in his eyes, hope, untouched and simple. She wished she could share it, but her heart felt heavy with the truth she carried. An old woman stopped Althea, grabbing her hand with a grip stronger than her frail frame suggested. "Is it true?" she asked, eyes wide with terror. "Are we going to end up like Atlantis?" Althea knelt, her fingers brushing a lock of the woman's white hair. "I don't know," she whispered. "But I fear we are too proud, too stubborn. I fear we are being warned." The woman's face crumpled, tears slipping down her withered cheeks. She had lived long enough to know that pride was a poison, that ignoring danger didn't make it vanish. Althea wished she could offer comfort, but even the gods seemed silent, their will unfathomable. The memory of Atlantis hung over them like a storm cloud, a story that had become a threat, too real to ignore. Nikaros, meanwhile, grew more determined to dismiss Althea's visions. He hosted feasts, where wine flowed and musicians played to drown out the rumblings of the earth. He laughed loudly, a performance for all to see, but there were moments, late at night, when even he couldn't quiet his own doubts. He would lie in his chamber, staring at the ceiling, feeling the small tremors that never seemed to end. Sometimes he thought he heard the sea, louder than it should have been, whispering against the shore as if in warning. But pride held him fast, a stubbornness too deep to break, even as fear tightened its grip around his heart. In the darkened corners of the palace, arguments flared. Servants exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to follow the skeptics or the believers. An advisor named Phoros, one of the king's most trusted men, caught Althea in a hallway one evening. His face was lined with worry. "You are right," he said softly, glancing around to make sure they were alone. "I feel it too. But what can we do? How do we convince those who will not see?" Althea's eyes, tired but resolute, met his. "We pray," she said. "And we prepare for whatever the gods decide." And so, the conflict raged on, louder and more desperate with each passing day. The lines were drawn, between those who refused to believe in curses and those who could feel them tightening around their necks. People spoke of Atlantis not just with fear but with bitterness, as if the lost city had cursed them with its very memory, a reminder of how even the most magnificent civilizations could crumble into the sea. The priests burned incense until the air grew thick with it, begging the gods for mercy, while skeptics poured wine over altars with mockery in their hearts, laughing as if that laughter could stave off the waves. But laughter could not stop the earth from shaking. It could not hold back the sea, which lapped at the shores with a hunger that felt ancient, inevitable. And Althea, standing on the cliffs at night, watched the horizon and wondered if she would live to see her people swallowed whole, just as Atlantis had been. A curse, they called it. A myth, some argued. But as the sky darkened and the air grew heavier, she could feel the truth pressing down like a weight on her chest, the echo of Atlantis singing through the waves. The sea was never silent. Even on the calmest days, when sunlight poured across the waves in a golden dance, the ocean whispered. Sometimes it whispered tales of fishermen's luck, of treasures found in the coral's embrace. Other times, it murmured warnings, the kind that made the skin prickle and hearts beat a little faster. Lately, those whispers had become something else entirely, something darker, something that curled through the salt air and wrapped around the sailors like an unseen serpent. It started slowly, a missing vessel here, a wrecked hull there. Ships that had been the pride of the Minoan fleet, built strong and steady, began to vanish as though the sea had swallowed them whole. Families waited on the shores, eyes scanning the horizon until they blurred with tears. They prayed to the gods, but the gods offered no answers. Only the waves returned, carrying nothing but silence. Young Aegeon had grown up on those very shores, the son of a humble fisherman. The sea was his second home, its rhythms as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. But even he had begun to feel uneasy, especially when he saw the hardened faces of seasoned sailors pale with fear. Whispers of a serpent beneath the waves spread like wildfire through the docks. Old men, usually quick to laugh off tales of sea monsters, now spoke quietly of sightings, of something vast and serpentine that moved just beneath the surface, its form glimpsed only as shadows against the setting sun. One evening, Aegeon found himself aboard a merchant ship bound for a nearby island, carrying a cargo of fine olive oil and honey. The sky was a deep indigo, stars winking into view like scattered embers, and the breeze carried the scent of the open sea. Yet there was an unnatural stillness in the air, a tension that made the crew exchange wary glances. Aegeon's hand rested on the rail, fingers tracing the old grooves where ropes had once been tied. He tried to calm himself, telling his heart that it was only stories, only fear feeding on itself. Then, the stillness shattered. It began with a low, rumbling groan that seemed to come from the depths of the ocean itself. The ship shuddered, as though something immense had brushed against its hull. Men shouted, eyes wide with panic, hands scrambling to hold onto anything stable. Aegeon stumbled, gripping the rail so hard his knuckles turned white. He leaned over the side, peering into the dark, churning waters, his breath caught in his throat. For a heartbeat, he saw it, a sinuous, glistening shape that coiled through the water, larger than any creature he could imagine. Scales shimmered in the moonlight, black and green and silver, a terrible beauty that made his blood run cold. It moved with a grace that defied its size, and he could swear he saw eyes, golden and ancient, staring back at him. Aegeon's breath came in shallow, terrified gasps. He felt as if the serpent were not merely a beast, but something far older, a being with knowledge of the ocean's deepest secrets, a guardian or perhaps a curse. The creature vanished into the dark, and the ship lurched once more. Men shouted prayers to every god they knew, clutching charms, throwing offerings overboard in frantic desperation. The sea calmed as suddenly as it had raged, the serpent gone without a trace. Aegeon stumbled back, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst. Yet the terror remained, coiled in his gut, a silent reminder of what he had seen. Rumors spread faster than the waves. When the ship returned to Knossos, battered but miraculously afloat, Aegeon's story lit a spark that burned through the city. Some believed him without question. Others, clinging to reason, said it was the madness of fear or perhaps a trick of the water. Yet deep down, every Minoan knew that their civilization's power lay in the sea, and now the sea was turning against them. No one could afford to dismiss the warnings, not when so much was at stake. The strategic loss was catastrophic. With each disappearance, with each ship that never came home, the Minoans' hold over the waters weakened. Their dominance, their lifeline of trade and wealth, was slipping through their fingers like sand. The council debated furiously, minds racing between military strategies and religious rites, trying to decide how to defend against something so vast and unknown. Priests and priestesses offered sacrifices, spilling blood on altars while the scent of burning incense mingled with the sea breeze. And then there were those who wondered if it was not the sea itself that had grown vengeful, but something far worse, a god, or a monster beyond the realm of mortal comprehension. Myths spoke of vengeful deities who lived beneath the waves, serpentine beings that could crush ships like driftwood. Aegeon remembered those golden eyes, that feeling of being judged, and shivered. The serpent had not lashed out in blind fury, it had seemed deliberate, almost curious. As though it were deciding something. One night, he found himself by the shore, staring at the endless, heaving expanse of black water. His feet sank into the cool, damp sand, and he felt small, insignificant. The waves whispered their stories, and he listened, searching for answers that would not come. Was the serpent a punishment, a warning, or simply the sea's own ancient rage made flesh? He remembered the sea as it had been in his childhood, vast but kind, generous in its gifts of fish and trade. Now it seemed different, an enemy waiting to strike. And yet, even as fear gripped the hearts of the Minoans, even as shipbuilders worked in silence and fishermen hesitated to cast their nets, life went on. Children played in the streets, and lovers walked hand in hand along the cliffs. But always, there was a sense of watching, waiting for the serpent to return. Mothers held their children a little tighter, and sailors prayed harder before setting out, fingers brushing over charms of protection. The serpent beneath the waves was more than a monster. It had become a symbol of the fragility of their world, of how quickly everything they had built could be lost. Aegeon wondered if they would ever truly be safe again, or if the sea had already chosen their fate. He closed his eyes, hearing once more the rumble from the deep, the echo of something ancient and unknowable. And he wondered if it would be enough, to pray, to fear, or if they would one day pay the price for all the stories they had ignored. The air tasted different. It carried a sour, acrid tang that clung to the back of the throat, heavy and unsettling. Farmers paused in their fields, hands still buried in the earth, as a low hum reverberated through the soil. The animals had sensed it first, sheep bleated in restless distress, and horses snorted, pawing nervously at the ground. Birds had abandoned their nests, taking to the sky in frantic flocks, their cries echoing like a desperate warning. Children playing near the olive groves froze mid-laughter, their games interrupted by an unshakable feeling that something ancient and malevolent had awakened. Overhead, the sky seemed different too, with clouds that twisted and roiled like serpents. A sinister, unnatural red bled into the sunset, as if the heavens themselves were drenched in blood. And all across Crete, hearts beat a little faster. In the temple precincts of Knossos, priestesses gathered in solemn assembly. They wore expressions carved from stone, their white robes rippling like ghostly apparitions as they offered incense to the statues of their gods. Irene, a young novice with wide, terrified eyes, clutched a clay bowl as she watched smoke curl and twist upward. The priests murmured fervent prayers to the fire gods, pleading for mercy. Some whispered that the great goddess herself was angry, that a balance had been broken, and now the earth rebelled. In the marketplace, people spoke in hushed tones, repeating stories they half believed but could not ignore. Elders recounted tales of fire-breathing gods battling beneath the land, of mountains cursed to burst into flame. They claimed that the earth's tremors were footsteps of divine warriors locked in combat, a struggle that humans could neither see nor understand. Fishermen pointed to the waters, noticing how the sea churned with unusual fervor, as if mirroring the agitation of whatever forces raged below. And then, as if the gods themselves willed it, the first great tremor struck. Buildings shuddered like living things, and pottery crashed to the ground in a cacophony of shattered clay. At the harbor, dockworkers shouted in alarm as boats rocked violently, ropes snapping, and waves slammed against the piers. Streets filled with the clamor of panic, as mothers pulled their children close and men ran to check on the integrity of their homes. A wall near the old city gate crumbled, sending a plume of dust spiraling into the air. Time seemed to fracture into a series of jagged moments, the trembling ground, the cracking stones, the collective gasp of a people suddenly made small. Yet in the midst of chaos, there were flashes of eerie stillness. A cow, lying motionless in the field, eyes wide and unblinking, seemed as lifeless as a statue. An olive tree, whose roots had split apart the soil, stood like a scarred sentinel, leaves shivering despite the lack of wind. Further to the north, across the wine-dark sea, Thera brooded silently. The island had always been beautiful and enigmatic, a crown of cliffs encircling a caldera that whispered of ancient, buried fury. But now, its heart had begun to smolder. Pale smoke streamed skyward in ghostly tendrils, mingling with the ash that blanketed the once lush vineyards. The mountain rumbled, a deep, groaning roar that seemed almost alive, as if some monstrous force was stirring from a centuries-old slumber. Scholars in later times would try to explain what happened next, drawing diagrams of magma chambers and tectonic plates, sketching the science of catastrophe. But for the Minoans, there was only the immediacy of divine wrath, a terror no explanation could soothe. Thera exploded with a violence so primal, so all-consuming, that it seemed to tear the sky apart. Fire and ash erupted into the heavens, blotting out the sun and turning day into a hellish twilight. Eyewitnesses would never forget what they saw. The sea, once a lifeblood of trade and prosperity, recoiled in terror. Waves raced away from the island as if the water itself was fleeing. When they returned, it was with the force of titans, crashing against the shores of Crete and swallowing entire villages. Fishermen clung to their capsized boats, their cries lost beneath the roar of the waves and the hissing steam where water met fire. One old man, who had watched the destruction from his perch on a high cliff, spoke of seeing gods in the sky. He swore that great, shadowy forms battled amidst the ash clouds, beings wreathed in flame and lightning, their rage shaking the earth. His voice trembled as he described it, the awe and terror still etched into his withered face. Others claimed to see chariots of fire streaking across the heavens, and some fell to their knees, convinced that the end of the world had arrived. In Knossos, the mighty palace that had once been a symbol of Minoan greatness now stood cracked and wounded. Fires raged in the city's outskirts, flames licking hungrily at wooden beams and consuming market stalls. A mother cradled her crying infant, her face streaked with soot and tears, while a priestess collapsed at the temple steps, her voice gone hoarse from desperate prayer. Irene, the young novice, found herself trapped in the temple's inner sanctum. The marble statues of the gods loomed over her, their expressions unmoved by the suffering outside. The ground heaved, and a great bronze urn toppled, spilling oil that ignited into flames. Irene sobbed, clutching her amulet of the great goddess, begging for salvation or at least for the end to come quickly. She could not tell if the fire that surrounded her was a manifestation of divine anger or a simple, human disaster. Still, some Minoans held out hope. They lit more candles, made more sacrifices, believing that somehow they could appease the deities. But as the sky rained ash and the sea turned hostile, the feeling of being forsaken grew. The land itself had become a battlefield, and the people were caught between forces too vast and ancient to comprehend. Somewhere, as darkness fell over the city, a seer emerged from the ruins, her hair matted with dust and her eyes wide and unfocused. Her voice carried through the smoky air, cracked and otherworldly. She spoke of a vision, two fire gods locked in eternal combat, one representing destruction and the other rebirth. She warned that the only way forward lay in a sacrifice, a surrender, or perhaps a hope that had not yet been realized. The people listened with a mix of fear and yearning, clutching at the remnants of their old beliefs, their old world. Yet even as the earth trembled and the flames consumed, a terrible question lingered: would they survive to rebuild, or was this the end of everything they had ever known? The sea, once a source of life and connection, had turned into a killer. The waves that had once gently lapped at the shores of Crete now rose like monstrous fists, crashing down on everything in their path. The people who had lived in harmony with the rhythm of the ocean now found themselves swallowed whole by its rage. Boats, homes, and entire villages disappeared beneath the churning, frothing waters, their last screams drowned beneath the relentless roar of the sea. For days, no one knew if the sun had risen or set. The sky, once blue and clear, had become a thick, oppressive gray, filled with ash and smoke that blotted out the light. It seemed as though the world itself had turned against the Minoans, as if the gods were punishing them for some unknown crime. Those who had survived the initial chaos now found themselves in a new, unrecognizable world, one where the earth still trembled beneath their feet and the air tasted like fire. The land that had once been rich with fields of wheat, vineyards, and olive trees was now scarred. The fertile soil, once warm and yielding, was now cracked and barren, scorched by the heat from the volcano and covered in thick layers of ash. No harvest would come from the earth, the crops had withered, burned, or been buried under the rubble. The animals that had not been swept away by the tsunamis lay dead in fields, their bodies bloated and rotting under the relentless sun. Hunger gnawed at the survivors. The streets, once filled with bustling markets and laughter, were now silent except for the occasional sob or desperate cry. Families huddled together, clutching at whatever scraps of food they could find, but it was never enough. The grain had spoiled, the fish were too few to catch, and the forests had burned to ash. The hunger grew into a gnawing ache that settled deep in the bones, and with it came a terrible weariness, a tiredness that no amount of rest could ease. But it was not just the hunger that had taken hold of the survivors. A sickness, slow and relentless, began to spread through the land. It started in the coastal villages where the water had carried the debris of the dead, tainting the streams and wells. Soon, the fever took root. It wasn't long before entire families lay in bed, feverish and weak, their skin pale and their bodies racked with pain. Some whispered that it was the punishment of the gods, a plague sent to finish what the earthquake and the fire had begun. In the midst of all this suffering, the people began to turn on each other. Those who had once been neighbors now looked at each other with suspicion, as if the hunger and disease had stripped away the very humanity from their souls. In some places, small groups of survivors hoarded food and water, guarding their meager stores like treasures. Trust, once the foundation of Minoan society, now seemed like a fragile memory, lost beneath the weight of despair. The survivors spoke in hushed tones about those who had tried to fight back, those who had dared to challenge the wrath of the earth and the sea. There were tales of men and women who had stood bravely on the shores as the waves came crashing down, trying to protect their homes and families. But the sea was merciless, and the waves had swallowed them whole. One tale spoke of a father who had tied himself to a great stone, hoping to anchor his family's boat as it was tossed by the storm. He had held on until the very end, his grip slipping only when the wave reached its peak, pulling him beneath the surface as his family watched in horror. In the ruins of Knossos, the grand palace now lay in heaps of broken stone, its walls crumbled and scorched. The once vibrant halls, filled with murals and mosaics, were now silent. Only the whispers of the dead seemed to echo through the empty rooms. The few who had managed to take shelter within the palace walls found no solace there. The cold, dark halls felt haunted by the absence of life, by the ghosts of a civilization that had once been great. As night fell, the survivors would gather in what remained of the great courtyards, speaking in low voices of the heroes who had tried to battle the elements and failed. Some had died trying to keep the fires from consuming their city. Others had sought refuge in the mountains, only to be buried by the ash. One old woman, whose wrinkled hands trembled as she spoke, told of a group of warriors who had climbed to the top of a mountain, determined to face the gods who had brought the destruction. They had prayed for strength, for the power to restore balance, but as the earth shook beneath them, they were swallowed by the very mountain they sought to conquer. They were brave, she said, her voice breaking. But even bravery cannot stop the gods when they are angry. It was not just the warriors who had tried to fight back. The priests and priestesses of Crete, those who had once guided the people through rituals and prayers, also made their attempts to appease the gods. They offered sacrifices, fruits, animals, even their own blood, but the gods remained silent. In some places, priests stood on the highest hills, calling for mercy, but the earth refused to listen. It felt as though every effort, every prayer, every hope was swallowed by the smoke and the ash. In the silence that followed the eruption, the people of Crete struggled to find meaning. The world they had known, the world of laughter and light, was now a shadow, a dream fading into the smoke and ruins. What had once seemed certain, the rhythm of the seasons, the prosperity of the land, the protection of the gods, now seemed fragile and broken. As the survivors looked around at the wreckage, they could not help but wonder, was this the beginning of the end? Had the gods truly abandoned them? Amid the pain, there were those who still clung to hope, who believed that somehow, despite everything, life could begin again. But as the survivors tried to rebuild, they could not escape the nagging feeling that something had been lost, something that could never be recovered. The great civilization of Crete, its palaces and its art, its bustling markets and its gods, had been brought to its knees. And the people could only wait, with trembling hands and heavy hearts, to see if they would rise again. The air was thick with tension as the wind howled through the crumbling halls of Knossos. The great palace, once a beacon of power and prosperity, now stood as a haunting reminder of what had been lost. The people of Crete, struggling to survive the devastation left in the wake of the eruption, had turned to their oracles and prophets for answers. They needed hope. They needed guidance. But the messages they received were nothing like they had hoped for. From the dark corners of the ruined city came whispers of visions, strange dreams, and eerie prophecies that seemed to come from nowhere. The oracle at Delphi had spoken, *A royal blood shall stain the earth, and the gods shall turn their faces away. The end of Crete is written in the stars. It was a chilling prophecy, one that sent shivers down the spines of those who heard it. It was said that the royal family, once held in reverence, would be the very ones to bring about their own destruction. One of their own would betray the gods, and with that betrayal, the world would collapse. The royal family, already reeling from the devastation, could not ignore the gravity of the warning. But who among them was the traitor? The question echoed through the palace halls, unanswered, leaving suspicion and fear to settle like a dark cloud over every gathering. Among the leaders, the uncertainty gnawed at them, but no one dared to speak openly about it. Who would accuse the gods' chosen rulers? Who would dare to point a finger? Priests and prophets, those once revered as the voice of the gods, began to argue among themselves. Each had a different interpretation of the prophecy. Some said the traitor had already been born, waiting to rise within the family, while others insisted that the gods had already made their judgment, and the prophecy was a final warning to all of Crete. The palace became a place of turmoil, as leaders who had once stood united now found themselves at odds. Each day brought a new report of strange events, earthquakes that rattled the city once more, strange birds flying in patterns that were never seen before, and unsettling dreams where the gods themselves were seen weeping. Some believed these were signs of the prophecy coming to life, that the betrayal was already set in motion. Others, more pragmatic, argued that the world was simply reacting to the devastation that had befallen them. But as the days dragged on, no one could shake the feeling that the gods were not done with their punishment. The debate reached a fever pitch when a young prophetess, known for her piercing visions, came to the palace one fateful afternoon. She had not spoken publicly for years, having been kept away by the priests who feared the weight of her words. But when she finally appeared, she brought with her a new prophecy, one that struck at the heart of the crisis. "The royal line is cursed," she proclaimed, her voice trembling with the weight of what she had seen. One will betray their gods, and with that betrayal, the sun will set on Crete forever. The gods will take their vengeance, and no walls will stand to protect you." Her words were like a dagger in the heart of the leaders, for they knew that, no matter how they tried to avoid it, the prophecy had already taken root. This new vision, so stark and so sure, divided the court even further. Some of the priests fell to their knees, believing that the gods had spoken through the prophetess. The royal family, already in turmoil from the aftermath of the disaster, found their unity shattered. Could they stand together if one of their own was to be the betrayer? Was it one of the kings or queens, or had the gods already marked the traitor in their midst? As the months passed, the political tension in the palace reached a boiling point. The leaders no longer trusted each other. Every glance seemed laced with suspicion. Every word spoken was measured, weighed, and analyzed for hidden meanings. The once vibrant halls of the palace now echoed with silence, broken only by the occasional heated argument between rival factions. The priests, once seen as the voices of reason, were divided in their council. Some demanded more sacrifices to appease the gods, while others warned that no amount of offerings would be enough if the prophecy was already set in motion. Within the palace walls, the royal family began to fracture. Whispers of betrayal grew louder, and accusations became more pointed. One of the queens, known for her wisdom and beauty, found herself under suspicion. Had she secretly defied the gods, or was she the one who had caused the gods to turn their wrath upon them? Her supporters vehemently denied it, but others began to see shadows of guilt in her eyes. It was the smallest of things, an unnoticed gesture, a fleeting moment of doubt, that seemed to confirm the growing belief that the prophecy was unfolding before their very eyes. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, the people of Crete began to feel the weight of the prophecy pressing down on them. In the villages, rumors spread like wildfire. Some believed that the royal family's internal strife would lead to their undoing, while others thought that the gods had already chosen their punishment. But no one knew for sure. The tension within the palace walls seeped out, infecting every corner of Crete. Even the streets felt different now, darker, more uncertain. And then, in the quiet of the night, the signs that had been ignored before began to take on a new significance. A dark omen appeared in the sky, a shadow that swept across the stars, blotting out the light. The wind shifted, and strange storms raged across the island. The sea, which had once been the source of life, now felt like an enemy. The ships that had once sailed confidently upon it now hesitated, as though they too sensed the coming storm. It was in this climate of fear and uncertainty that the prophecy seemed more real than ever. The people of Crete could not escape the feeling that the gods were watching them, waiting for the moment when the royal family would make their fatal mistake. The royal line, once the embodiment of strength and power, now seemed fragile, a house of cards ready to tumble. The gods had made their choice, and all that was left to do was wait for the moment of betrayal to come. In the heart of the palace, amidst the shattered peace and growing fear, the future of Crete hung by a thread. The prophecy had been spoken, and no one knew if they could outrun it. Some still believed that the gods could be appeased, that a final offering would change the course of fate. But for many, the feeling that doom was inevitable crept into their hearts. The story of the Minoans had come to a crossroads, and with the coming of the prophecy, everything was about to change. The gates of Knossos groaned as they were pushed open, not by the winds, but by the force of something far darker. The tremors that had plagued the land were nothing compared to the quake that rippled through the very heart of Crete when the first sight of them appeared on the horizon. The foreign ships, black sails stretched high like vultures descending, drew closer with every passing moment. The people, who had been living in the fragile hope that peace would return to their island, suddenly faced a new terror. Whispers turned to screams as the first raiders stepped onto the shores. Tall, broad, and heavy with armor, they moved like shadows. Their faces, obscured by dark helmets and crude armor, were like the horrors from the nightmares of children. The Minoans, who had once ruled the seas with such certainty, now watched helplessly as these strangers laid their claim to the very shores that had once been their domain. The people of Crete had heard the stories of the Mycenaeans before, but they had never believed them. The Mycenaeans were said to be driven by dark gods, gods who demanded blood, fire, and destruction. Their warriors were no mere men, it was said, but monsters in human form. Fierce, unstoppable, and without mercy. Tales of their cruel raids had reached the Minoan shores, but they were just stories. Now, those stories were walking down the beaches, swords drawn and eyes burning with an unknown fury. The Minoans had always prided themselves on their art, their culture, their beauty. They lived in harmony with the land and the sea. But the Mycenaeans brought something else with them, something colder, sharper, and more violent. It wasn't just a clash of weapons that rang out over the land, it was the sound of an ancient world crumbling under the weight of a new one. They fought not for glory, but for domination. The first skirmishes were swift and brutal. The Minoans, unaccustomed to such savagery, found themselves outmatched by the sheer force of the invaders. The Mycenaeans struck with the precision of a predator hunting its prey. The Minoans, with their art and their rituals, were not prepared for this kind of war. Their soldiers, though brave, were overwhelmed by the sudden ferocity of the attackers. The once beautiful streets of Knossos, once bustling with life and culture, were now stained with the marks of battle. But it wasn't just the soldiers who feared the invaders. The people of Crete, who had lived in relative peace for so long, felt a chill spread through their hearts. The very air seemed to shift, thick with dread. Mothers kept their children close, whispering to them that the gods had abandoned them. The priests, once confident in their communication with the divine, now offered no answers, no guidance. The Mycenaeans were not just invaders, they were harbingers of something worse. The myths that had been passed down through generations began to take on new meaning. They had always spoken of monstrous creatures that came from beyond the sea, creatures that were driven by darker forces. But now, as the Mycenaeans ravaged the land, those ancient tales no longer seemed so distant. The warriors who walked the shores of Crete felt like the very embodiment of those myths. They were the creatures from the stories, but they were no longer the stuff of legends. They were real. And they were terrifying. As the Mycenaeans pushed further into the heart of the island, they did not just take lives, they took the spirit of Crete with them. The land that had once been full of laughter and art now echoed with the sounds of swords clashing and the cries of the fallen. The Minoans, who had once viewed the world with wonder, now found themselves questioning everything. Had the gods forsaken them? Had they done something to anger the divine? Was this the punishment they had been warned about? Or was this simply the end of a civilization, a shift of power that could not be stopped? Within the palace walls, the leaders debated what to do. Some called for a retreat, flee into the mountains, and hide. Others, more defiant, wanted to stand and fight, hoping the gods would smile upon their bravery. The high priestess, once a figure of unquestionable authority, now stood in front of the people, her voice shaking as she spoke. She had seen the omens, she had heard the prophecies. But what good were prophecies in the face of such unstoppable force? And so, in the midst of this terror, something else began to emerge. A fear that was deeper than just the threat of the Mycenaeans. A fear of what these invaders represented. They were not just conquerors. They were destroyers. The Mycenaeans were more than a rival power, they were the end of an era. They were the doom of everything the Minoans had built, the antithesis of everything Crete had been. Their darkness seemed to pour into the very earth beneath their feet, turning the once vibrant lands of Crete into something barren and desolate. The skies, too, seemed to agree. A strange stillness fell over the island as if the world was holding its breath. The sea, once the lifeblood of the Minoans, now felt like a place of danger, a dark expanse that no longer carried the promise of trade or wealth, but of monsters and death. Every ship that left the harbor felt like it was sailing into the mouth of a beast, and many of them never returned. In the villages, the stories of the invaders began to morph into something else. People no longer saw the Mycenaeans as mere men, but as creatures sent by the gods to test them. Tales spread of men who could not be killed, of warriors who seemed to rise again no matter how many times they fell. They were gods in human form, or so the people believed. And in that belief, there was a deeper fear that if these men could not be defeated, it was not just their land that was at risk, it was their very souls. As the battles grew more fierce, a strange sense of futility crept over the land. The people of Crete began to wonder if they had ever truly known peace. Perhaps it had always been an illusion, a brief moment in time before the inevitable clash of cultures. Perhaps the Minoans, for all their beauty and grandeur, had always been meant to fall. And now, in the face of these invaders, that fall was coming faster than anyone could have ever imagined. But the Minoans were not without hope, not without a spark of defiance. Despite the odds, despite the fear, there were those who fought back. They would not let their culture die without a fight. In the streets of Knossos, warriors and commoners alike stood shoulder to shoulder, their swords raised against the darkness. And as the first blood was spilled on the shores of Crete, one thing was certain: this battle, this clash of cultures, would not be forgotten. It would echo through the ages as the final stand of a civilization that refused to be erased. The ground trembled beneath Akrotiri, as though the city itself was shuddering in fear. The air was thick, suffocating, heavy with the scent of ash and a creeping sense of doom. In the distance, the mountains, which had once stood as silent sentinels watching over the vibrant city, now seemed to grow restless, shifting like dark giants awakening from a deep slumber. Lena stood in the heart of the city, her eyes wide, her breath shallow, and her heart racing. She had always heard the stories, the warnings whispered in the shadows of the great hallways, about how the gods could be vengeful and how nature itself could turn against those who had once been its stewards. But no one had ever prepared her for this. No one had ever told her that the ground could crack open beneath her feet, or that the skies could fill with the roar of gods angry beyond measure. The streets that had once been full of laughter, trade, and music were now eerily silent. The grand buildings, covered in intricate frescoes, were still standing, but their beauty was no longer a comfort. It was a cruel reminder of what was being lost. As the tremors continued to shake the city, the ground around her cracked, sending clouds of dust and ash into the air. The air itself seemed to burn. Everywhere she looked, the once pristine city of Akrotiri, her home, was crumbling, falling apart like an ancient ruin swallowed by time. She couldn't stay. She had to leave. But where could she go? The city was trapped, surrounded on all sides by the wrath of the earth, and the ocean beyond seemed to churn with violent intent. She turned, desperate for some sign, some way out, and it was then that she saw them, the priests. A group of figures moved with urgency through the smoke-filled streets, their robes fluttering like dark wings in the wind. They were chanting, their voices low and almost drowned out by the rumble of the earth. Lena had grown up listening to their words, hearing the prophecies, the rituals, and the tales of gods who walked among them, guiding their fate. But she had never seen them like this, desperate, frantic. They were no longer the calm and wise figures of authority she had known. They were pleading, calling on the gods, but their prayers seemed to be unanswered. Lena's feet carried her toward them, drawn by the need for answers, though her heart told her there were none. She arrived just in time to hear the high priest utter the final words of a prayer, one that sounded more like a desperate plea for mercy than anything resembling hope. The priests were performing a ritual, one that had been passed down for generations, one that they believed would shield their souls from the coming destruction. As the flames from the volcano in the distance grew brighter, the high priest looked at Lena, his eyes wide with fear. "The gods have turned away from us, child," he said, his voice breaking. "We are not meant to survive this. But we can at least protect ourselves from the wrath to come." She wanted to scream, to ask why, to demand what she was supposed to do. But the words caught in her throat. Instead, she turned away, her heart heavy with the weight of their doom. The city around her was suffocating, closing in, the ground shaking with an intensity that rattled her bones. She ran. She didn't know where to go, she only knew that she couldn't stay. The sounds of destruction were everywhere, the crackling of fires, the groaning of buildings as they buckled under the weight of the earth's fury. As she moved through the streets, she encountered others, families, merchants, children, all running in a desperate search for safety. But there was no safety. Not here. Not anymore. Lena's mind raced as she ran. Where could she go? The gods, the priests, they had all failed them. The city was falling apart, and there was no escape, no way to avoid the fury of the volcano. As the sky darkened, she could feel the heat of the eruption pressing down on her, like an invisible force, burning her skin, choking her with every breath. The once beautiful city of Akrotiri, the city that had been the jewel of the Aegean, was now a place of horror. As she reached the edge of the city, the ocean before her seemed to be pulling away, as though retreating from the impending disaster. The air smelled of sulfur, the skies above clouded with thick ash. Lena's heart sank. Even the sea that had always been a source of life and trade, seemed to be conspiring against them. And then, as if the earth had not already taken enough, something shifted in the water. A shadow. It moved beneath the surface, long and undulating, like a serpent. Lena froze. Was it a mirage? Had the heat and smoke finally clouded her vision? No. The shadow moved again, closer now, its outline unmistakable. The sea monster, long a creature of myth, seemed to rise from the depths, its scales shimmering as it breached the surface of the water. Lena's breath caught in her throat, her mind struggling to comprehend the sight before her. Was it the wrath of the gods? A sign of their punishment? The great serpent of the sea, once only a story told around the fire, was real. It was here, watching her, its eyes glowing with a malevolent intensity. A cold shiver ran down her spine. The land was dying. The gods were angry. And the monsters, real or imagined, were now walking among them. The priests, now only a distant memory, had sealed their fate with their desperate ritual. But they, too, would not escape. For the gods had spoken in fire and ash. And Akrotiri would fall, consumed by the earth and sea. But Lena, though terrified, could not surrender to the despair that threatened to consume her. As the sky split open with the roar of the volcano, as the earth cracked beneath her feet and the water rose around her, Lena knew that she would fight until the very last breath. She would not let her home, her people, be forgotten by the chaos. She would survive. She would carry their memory with her, even if it meant walking through fire, through water, and through the monsters of the sea. And so, as the city of Akrotiri fell, so too did its people, their stories, their struggles, and their triumphs, scattered like ashes in the wind. The gods had spoken. The earth had claimed its due. And the sea had become the final tomb for those who had once dared to live in its embrace. The palace halls had once echoed with the sounds of vibrant celebrations, of laughter and music that filled the air with a sense of unity. But now, a heavy silence loomed over the great chambers of the Minoan elite. Whispers spread like wildfire, each one more damning than the last. A name, once respected, now tainted by the rot of betrayal, Dorian, a man whose ambition had begun to outgrow the very walls of his ancestral home. It started subtly, as these things often do, small gestures, quiet shifts in power. Dorian had always been an ambitious man, but there was something in his eyes now, something darker, as if the gods had long since abandoned him and left only a hollow drive for more. The Minoans had long lived by their traditions, their worship of the gods, their respect for the natural order. But Dorian had grown restless with the weight of the old ways. He saw opportunity in chaos, and the breaking of the established order. His whispers were careful at first, words veiled in the soft tones of persuasion. He spoke of a future that would be more prosperous, more powerful, if only they could cast aside the constraints of tradition, if only they could rise above the gods' demands. His words seemed harmless to some, even promising. The old guard, those who still clung to the ways of the priests and the sacred rituals, had no idea how to silence his influence. Slowly, like a creeping vine, Dorian's reach extended. His promises of power, of wealth, caught the attention of those who had grown tired of the endless rituals and offerings to gods they believed had abandoned them. He had their ears, and soon, their hearts. But in his eyes, there was no reverence for the gods, no understanding of the fragile balance that kept their world from descending into chaos. He only saw a means to an end, the throne of power, the glory of control. And with every word he spoke, every deal he made, the gods watched with growing fury. It wasn't long before cracks began to form in the heart of the once unshakable Minoan society. The high priests, those who had stood as pillars of faith and tradition, felt the tremors of the growing shift. They saw the signs, offering rituals abandoned, prayers left unanswered, and the sacred temples left to crumble. They tried to speak against Dorian, tried to call the people back to the god's favor. But the people had already begun to follow him, lured by the promise of a future where their fates were no longer determined by divine whim but by their own hands. The betrayal was not just political. It was spiritual, a fracture in the very soul of the Minoan people. Dorian had dared to believe that he could outwit the gods, that he could control fate itself. And in doing so, he had weakened the sacred ties that bound their world together. As the tension in the palace reached a boiling point, strange events began to unfold. The earth, which had long been a source of life and sustenance, began to show its anger. Earthquakes rumbled beneath the feet of the Minoans, sending ripples of fear through the city. The seas, once a symbol of life and prosperity, became unpredictable and violent, swallowing ships and drowning sailors without warning. The skies darkened with storms, and the sun seemed to lose its warmth, as if the gods themselves had turned their backs on the land. The Minoans, who had once believed themselves favored by the gods, now found themselves abandoned, left to face the consequences of their own greed and ambition. And in the heart of the palace, Dorian stood tall, unrepentant, blind to the disaster he had set into motion. His eyes gleamed with triumph, but there was a hollowness in his smile, a knowing that the power he had gained was built on the ruins of everything he once held dear. One by one, the signs grew more undeniable. The great bull, once a symbol of the Minoan people's strength and unity, began to appear in unsettling dreams and visions. It charged through the streets, its eyes burning with fury, tearing apart the city in its wake. The people, once so proud of their connection to the divine, now cowered in fear, torn between their loyalty to Dorian and the primal fear of angering the gods further. In the temples, the priests gathered, performing desperate rituals to plead for mercy, but it was too late. Dorian's betrayal had already broken the delicate balance between the mortal and divine. The gods' anger could no longer be silenced by offerings or prayers. The earth rumbled louder, and the seas rose higher, their monstrous waves a reflection of the growing chaos within the hearts of the people. The betrayal of the gods had set the world on a path toward destruction, and there was no turning back. The myths spoke of this moment, of how betrayal could shatter the heavens and bring ruin to the earth. They spoke of the great gods who punished the traitor with fire and flood, of the curses that would follow those who turned their backs on what was sacred. Dorian, in his blind ambition, had become the very embodiment of these myths. His desire for power had awakened forces he could never have imagined, and now they were closing in on him. The gods were not merciful, and as Dorian's influence continued to spread, the disasters grew more intense. Earthquakes ravaged the land. Wildfires consumed everything in their path. The once beautiful city of Knossos, with its grand palaces and ornate halls, now stood as a shadow of its former self, crumbling under the weight of the betrayal that had been allowed to fester within its walls. And still, Dorian refused to see the truth. He had won the political battle, but he had lost the war for his soul. His pursuit of power had led him down a path where the very earth beneath his feet seemed to reject him. In his quest for control, he had lost all connection to the gods and the world they had shaped. The final days of Dorian were marked by loneliness and madness. Once surrounded by those who had believed in his vision, he now found himself standing alone, watching as the ruins of his dreams crumbled before him. The city he had sought to control was slipping through his fingers, and with each passing day, the gods drew nearer. He had betrayed them, and now, like all those who had come before him, he would face the consequences of his actions. In the end, it was not the armies that brought Dorian down, nor the political rivals who had once whispered his name in fear. It was the wrath of the gods, the very forces he had believed he could command, that tore his world apart. And as the final cataclysm struck, Dorian realized too late that no man, no matter how powerful, could escape the punishment of the gods once the scales had been tipped. The streets of the great cities once thrived with life, now they are eerily silent. The grand halls, where leaders spoke of glory and prosperity, stand empty, their ornate columns slowly crumbling into dust. The marketplaces that once echoed with the bustling of merchants and traders, where goods from distant lands were exchanged, now lie barren. The city of Knossos, once a symbol of strength, now feels like a hollow shell of its former self, abandoned by the very people who once called it home. In the distance, the great city of Akrotiri is nothing more than a silhouette against the smoke-filled sky. Fires still rage where the homes once stood, flickering like forgotten memories of a past that no longer seems to matter. There's no one left to watch over these ruins, no one to tend to the dying gardens or rebuild the walls. The heart of the civilization is slowly being eaten away by the ravages of time, nature, and something darker, the wrath of the gods. The priests and priestesses, those once revered for their knowledge and connection to the divine, now walk the deserted streets in despair. Their robes, once so vibrant, are now torn and dusty. Their faces are drawn, hollow with fear and hopelessness. They speak in hushed voices of omens, of signs from the gods that are too dreadful to ignore. But no one listens anymore. The gods, they say, have turned away. The earth quakes beneath their feet, the seas rise higher with each passing day, and the skies above grow darker. The once sacred rituals no longer feel like a bridge between mortals and gods, but a futile attempt to appease forces that have already abandoned them. The priests claim that the gods have grown angry, that they are punishing the people for their disobedience, for their betrayal of tradition. There was once a time when people gathered at the temples, bringing offerings and prayers, believing that the gods would listen, would grant them favor. But those days are gone now. The gods no longer answer, and the earth itself seems to tremble with the weight of their silence. In the fields, the peasants speak in whispers of what they have seen, of what they fear. Their homes have been swallowed by the earth, their crops withered by fire, and their loved ones taken by the sea. They speak of heroes, great warriors and leaders who once fought to protect their people but failed. They tell stories of gods who grew wrathful and consumed their people in a flood of fire and destruction. There are no more heroes, no more great warriors to save them. The peasants have only their memories, and even those are beginning to fade. They speak of a time when the gods were merciful, when the sun shone brightly and the harvest was bountiful. They tell of warriors who fought with the strength of gods and of queens who ruled with wisdom and grace. But those stories now seem like fairy tales, distant and unreachable. The world they knew has disappeared, and with it, their hope. As the days grow colder and the nights longer, the sky above seems to darken, as if the very heavens themselves mourn the fall of a once great civilization. The gods no longer answer the prayers of the people, and the earth has become a cruel reminder of the price of betrayal. The seas rise higher, crashing against the shores with an unstoppable force, drowning entire villages. The ground trembles beneath their feet, as if it is alive with anger, threatening to swallow everything whole. The air itself is thick with the scent of ash and despair. The people who remain are few, wandering in search of safety, unsure of where to turn. There is no leadership now, only the remnants of a shattered society, scrambling to survive. Those who once held power now hide in the shadows, too afraid to face the consequences of their actions. The great cities, once centers of culture and trade, are nothing more than tombs. The ruins stand as a testament to the fragility of civilization, to the fleeting nature of glory. They are the last echoes of a people who believed they could conquer the world, only to be undone by their own arrogance. The stories that the peasants tell grow darker, more desperate. They speak of the gods' vengeance, of monsters that walk the earth, of fires that consume everything in their path. They speak of the heavens breaking open, of floods that drown entire lands. In the whispers of the wind, they hear the voices of the gods, and it is not a voice of mercy. The gods are angry, they say. And the people have no one to blame but themselves. The lands that once knew peace are now haunted by the ghosts of those who have fallen, by the cries of the lost. In the ruins, the last of the priests perform their final rituals, hoping against hope that some divine hand will reach down and save them, but deep in their hearts, they know it is too late. The gods have withdrawn their favor, and the world they once knew is slipping away. As the darkness grows, so too does the sense of fear. The gods have turned away, and the earth itself has become a monster, devouring all in its path. People run, hiding from the fury of nature and the vengeance of the divine, but there is nowhere to go. The world has become a maze of destruction, and no one can find their way out. In the stillness of the night, the few who remain speak of what they have lost. They speak of families torn apart, of homes destroyed, and of dreams that have turned to dust. There is no future, no hope, just the endless echo of the past. The gods are no longer there to hear their cries, and the earth has become a graveyard where the bones of the lost are scattered beneath the weight of time. The final days of the Minoans are marked not by the triumph of heroes, but by the quiet desperation of those who remain. The gods have turned their faces from them, and there is no one left to save them. The world they once knew is slipping through their fingers, and with each passing day, it feels as though the very earth itself is crumbling beneath them. The Minoan people, once so proud, are now a shadow, wandering through a land that has been abandoned by both the gods and the hope they once held so tightly. The air in Knossos was thick with tension, as if even the heavens were holding their breath. The once proud city, now standing in the shadow of its own destruction, was about to witness one last attempt to restore what had been lost. The ground trembled beneath the feet of the gathered people, a reminder of the earth's fury, and the sky above was heavy with an unsettling stillness. This was not just any ritual, it was the final bull leap, the desperate attempt to win back favor from the gods. A crowd had gathered at the great palace, eyes filled with both fear and hope. For years, they had prayed, sacrificed, and begged for a sign, any sign, that the gods would listen, that the world could be saved from the crumbling ruin that surrounded them. The great tradition of bull leaping, where the brave dared to grasp the horns of wild bulls and leap over their powerful backs, had been the hallmark of Minoan strength. It was a sacred act, one meant to honor the gods and demonstrate the bond between the mortal and the divine. But today, the ritual felt different. There was no joy in the faces of the spectators, no laughter in the air. The world had changed. The gods had turned away, their silence deafening. The once vibrant city was now a place of ashes and dust, its people haunted by the knowledge that their time was slipping away. The bull leap, once a symbol of power and triumph, had become a last, desperate plea. As the young man stood before the great beast, his heart pounded in his chest, each beat a reminder of the perilous choice he had made. His name was Eryx, a young warrior who had been chosen by the priests to perform the final act, the last hope of a dying civilization. The bull before him was massive, its muscles rippling beneath its dark hide. It snorted and pawed at the ground, sensing the tension in the air, the fear of the people, and the weight of the world on its shoulders. Eryx stared into its eyes, trying to steady his breath, but the fear threatened to overwhelm him. The crowd fell silent as the ritual began. The priests chanted, their voices rising and falling in a haunting rhythm, calling on the gods to hear their pleas. The wind picked up, whipping through the columns of the palace, carrying with it a chill that seemed to seep into the bones of everyone present. The gods, it seemed, were watching, but would they answer? Would they show mercy? Eryx stepped forward, his body trembling, but his resolve unshaken. He had been trained for this moment, prepared for this leap. But as he approached the bull, something felt wrong. The earth beneath him seemed to shift, and the sky darkened, as though the gods themselves were watching, waiting for something more than just a display of bravery. Eryx gripped the bull's horns, feeling the power of the beast beneath him, the sheer force of life that surged through it. He jumped, his heart leaping into his throat, grasping for a moment of divine connection. But as he soared through the air, something shifted. The bull, wild and untamed, bucked violently, throwing Eryx off course. His body collided with the earth with a sickening thud. A gasp ran through the crowd. Blood stained the ground beneath him, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold still. Eryx lay there, motionless, the life draining from his body. His blood mingled with the dust, the final offering to the gods who had turned their backs on them. The priests cried out in horror, their chants faltering. The divine wrath they had so feared seemed to have arrived. The earth trembled once more, as though it could no longer bear the weight of their sins. The sky darkened further, the storm that had been building in the distance now at their doorstep. Lightning flashed across the heavens, and thunder rumbled, shaking the very foundations of the palace. The gods, it seemed, were no longer listening. Their anger had been ignited, and the consequences were unfolding before them. The crowd stood in stunned silence. The great bull leap, the final act of defiance, had ended in tragedy. The blood of their last champion stained the earth, a symbol of their failure to appease the gods. The hope that had briefly flickered in their hearts was now extinguished, replaced by the heavy realization that no ritual, no sacrifice, could undo what had been done. The gods had spoken, and they had judged. The young man's body was carried away, but the silence remained, suffocating. It felt as though the earth itself had swallowed them whole, leaving only emptiness in its wake. The priests looked to one another, their faces pale, their prayers a whisper in the wind. The gods had not been merciful, and the city of Knossos had no answers. Eryx's family, those who had loved him, gathered to mourn, their grief rising in a quiet wail that echoed through the desolate city. In the shadows of the crumbling walls, they could hear the sound of the earth groaning beneath the weight of their despair. The last bull leap had ended not in glory, but in bloodshed, a tragic reminder that even the bravest souls cannot overcome the wrath of the gods. As the storm raged on, so too did the hopelessness. The people of Knossos had placed their faith in this final act, but it had not been enough. The gods were gone, and with them, the last vestiges of hope. The once proud city of the Minoans now lay broken, and with it, the world that had once stood at the pinnacle of power. The last bull leap had ended in blood and tears, marking the end of an era. The gods had judged them, and the price had been steep. What remained was only silence, the kind of silence that follows after the fall of a great civilization, when all that's left are the whispers of the past, carried away on the wind. The sound of footsteps echoed across the once grand halls of Knossos, now silent and cold. The city, so full of life just a generation ago, had fallen to ruin, its people scattered like ashes in the wind. The walls that had once held stories of power, worship, and glory now stood as broken skeletons, a shadow of the greatness they once embodied. The sun had barely risen that morning when the first ships appeared on the horizon. They were not from the distant shores of Egypt, nor the lands of the Near East, but from a place even closer, across the sea. The Mycenaeans. Their ships, large and fearsome, cut through the calm waters, their sails dark against the light of the sky. It was not the arrival of traders or peaceful visitors. No, these were invaders, their eyes set on a broken land ripe for conquest. For the survivors of the Minoan civilization, this was the final blow. The gods had turned their backs on them, the cities they had once called home were now overrun by the dead, and now the Mycenaeans came to claim what was left. They landed with ruthless precision, their warriors stepping ashore with the confidence of men who knew they would face no serious opposition. The Minoans, broken by years of disaster and betrayal, had no strength left to fight. In the days that followed, the old ways were forgotten, buried beneath the iron boots of the new rulers. The Minoan survivors, those few who remained, scattered like leaves in the wind. Some fled to the mountains, seeking refuge in caves and hidden valleys, too proud to submit to the invaders, but too fearful to stand their ground. The younger generations, who had never known anything but the decay of their once great civilization, clung to the old myths, telling stories of their ancestors' glory, stories of gods who once walked the earth and of treasures hidden deep within the ruins of the palace. The Mycenaeans, with their crude and brutal methods, enslaved those they could find. The once proud Minoans, the descendants of a people who had built wonders of art, architecture, and technology, were now reduced to mere shadows of what they had been. Women were taken as slaves, children torn from their families, their faces stained with tears, and men pressed into labor under the harsh overseers. It was a crushing weight, heavier than any of the stones that had once built the grand palaces. The myths, though, they did not die. Whispers spread among the survivors, tales of treasures buried deep beneath the ruins, of ancient relics that could turn the tide of fate. These treasures, it was said, were guarded by the very spirits of those who had died in the downfall of the city. The gods were silent, but the spirits of the fallen still lingered, trapped in the ruins, forever watching, forever waiting. Some believed that these relics held the key to the gods' favor, that with the right offering, the gods might return to reclaim their lost people. The survivors clung to these stories, passing them from one to another, not as a means of hope, but as a last desperate cry for meaning in a world that had abandoned them. The Minoans had once believed that they were chosen by the gods, that their civilization was blessed, but now they were nothing more than scattered remnants. The mountains, the caves, and the distant valleys became the last refuge, but even there, the Mycenaeans were coming. Slowly, methodically, they began to hunt down the last of the Minoans, driven by greed, by the promise of the treasures that had been whispered about for so long. In one mountain cave, a group of Minoan survivors gathered around an old woman. She was hunched with age, her face marked by the passage of time and sorrow. In her eyes burned the last ember of a fading hope. She spoke of the treasures, of the great relics hidden away beneath the walls of the fallen city. Her words were soft, almost reverent, as if speaking them aloud might somehow awaken something, anything, that might restore what had been lost. The young men, hungry for any chance to regain what they had lost, listened intently. They were not like the older generation, who had lived through the glory days and seen it slip away. The youth had only known suffering, only known a land in decay. Yet they still clung to the old stories, the stories of gods, of heroes, and of treasures that lay beneath the earth. The old woman spoke of a relic, a golden crown, crafted by the gods themselves. She said that whoever found it would hold the power to command the gods, to bring them back to the earth, to restore the Minoans to their rightful place in the world. But the legends also told of a curse. Those who sought the relic would never leave the city alive. They would be driven mad by the spirits who guarded it, forced to wander the streets as the souls of the fallen whispered in their ears, reminding them of their failure, their betrayal. The crown, they said, was not a gift, it was a test, a final judgment. The gods had abandoned the Minoans, but they had left behind the relics as a reminder of their wrath. The survivors who sought them would be met with ghosts and nightmares. Still, they pressed on. In the shadows of the crumbling palace, they searched for the relic, hoping that the old woman's words were not merely the ramblings of a broken mind, but the key to their salvation. The Mycenaeans were closing in, and they knew that if they were to survive, they had to take what little hope remained and turn it into something real. They couldn't let go of the stories, not when the spirits of their ancestors still haunted the land, still whispered of the treasures that could restore the gods to their people. But the ghosts were not kind. The deeper they went into the ruins, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The air was thick with a presence that could not be seen, but was felt in the chill of every step. The spirits did not welcome them. They had their own sorrow, their own anger. The survivors were not the ones to restore the gods, they were the ones who had failed, the ones who had turned away. As they reached the heart of the palace, where the relic was said to lie, a chill wind blew through the crumbling columns. The treasure they sought was no longer a promise of salvation, but a final reminder of everything that had been lost. The ghosts of the past watched silently, knowing that nothing could restore what had been destroyed. The Mycenaeans may have taken the land, but the Minoans, broken, scattered, and enslaved, carried with them the last remnants of a civilization that had once been the heart of the Mediterranean. And though their voices would be silenced, their stories would endure, whispered like the wind through the ruins. The wind howled through the empty streets of Knossos, whispering the names of those who had once walked its grand halls. The city was silent now, but in the eerie quiet, there was a feeling that the past hadn't fully departed. It clung to the air, to the stones, to the very soil beneath the ruins. The gods were silent, and so was the land, yet the stories, the myths, still lived. It was said that after the fall of the Minoan civilization, as the survivors scattered into the mountains and deserts, they became something more than just people. They became legends. The stories of their once great city and its people faded into the shadows, but in the darkness, they thrived. The survivors, those few who still remembered, carried with them tales that would grow into the myths of another time, another place. In the lands far beyond the crumbled walls of Knossos, the myths began to take shape. The labyrinth, the great maze beneath the palace, where the monstrous Minotaur was said to dwell, became a symbol, not just of a mythic creature, but of the entire Minoan civilization, lost to the depths of history. The labyrinth was no longer just a maze, it was the place where the gods had hidden away the secrets of the past, a place that no one could find, but everyone would seek. As the years passed, the faces of the Minoans faded, but the echoes of their lives were transformed into something timeless. The labyrinth was no longer a physical place, it became a metaphor for the lost greatness, a symbol of the Minoans' vanished civilization, and a reminder that something beautiful, something powerful, had been taken from the world. The story of the Minotaur grew, and the labyrinth, once a place of kings and priests, now became a place of monsters and heroes. Among the stories, one stood out, the tale of a mysterious priestess, a woman who wandered the lands long after the fall of the great city. She was a shadow of the past, carrying with her the memory of a world that had once known beauty, art, and knowledge. Some said she was the last of the Minoan priests, others whispered she had been blessed by the gods, chosen to carry the old stories to those who had forgotten. Her name was lost to time, but her presence lingered in every place she visited. In villages tucked away in mountain valleys, she would appear, an apparition wrapped in the tattered robes of a forgotten age. Her eyes held the weight of centuries, and when she spoke, it was as though the voices of the gods themselves echoed through her words. She would tell stories of the Minoan people, stories of their glory, their fall, and the gods who had turned away from them. To the people she encountered, the priestess seemed both ancient and ageless, as though she was both a part of the past and a living connection to the future. The villagers who listened to her would sit around fires, eyes wide with wonder, as she wove her tales. They heard of a time when the Minoans ruled the seas, when their art and architecture were unmatched, when their gods walked among them and favored their every step. But with every story, there was an undercurrent of sadness, a sense of something lost. The priestess would speak of the gods' anger, of how their favor had turned to wrath, and how the Minoans' greatest mistake had been forgetting their own humility. As she spoke, the villagers would lean in, eager for the connection, for the touch of something ancient and powerful. But the priestess's words often turned dark, and she would speak of a time when the gods had demanded more than the people were willing to give. She would tell of the sacrifices that had been made, of the blood spilled in the name of the gods, and how, in the end, it was not enough. The gods turned away, leaving the Minoans to crumble under their own weight. The priestess, though, always ended her stories with a sigh. She spoke of how the gods had been kind at one time, but how humans, in their pride, had lost their way. Her tales made the villagers uneasy, for they spoke of a world not unlike their own, where the gods might once again turn their backs on the living. They listened intently, the fear creeping into their hearts as they looked to the skies, wondering if the gods would ever return to save them. Or had they too already abandoned the world, leaving only the memories of those who had once been? One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the priestess spoke of something darker. She told of a treasure, hidden deep within the ruins of Knossos, something that the gods had left behind, a relic of such power that it could restore the old world or destroy it entirely. The treasure, she said, was not just gold or jewels, but a key that could open the door to the gods' favor once more. But the treasure was guarded, not by men, but by the very spirits of the past, the souls of those who had died in the fall of the city. This treasure became a myth in its own right, a story told from village to village. No one knew if the priestess had truly seen it, or if it was simply a tale spun from the desperation of a world trying to grasp at something, anything, to restore what had been lost. The idea of the treasure lingered, a silent promise in the wind, and even in the quietest of villages, people began to speak of it. Could it be real? Could the gods one day return, bringing with them the riches and glory of a world that had been forgotten? The priestess, now a living myth herself, continued to wander. Her face, once youthful, grew more and more like the crumbling ruins she spoke of. Her words, always haunting, faded into whispers. Yet the stories of the Minoan people, of their downfall and their gods' abandonment, did not fade. They grew, they lived, they became part of the fabric of the land. And though the Minoans had vanished, their ghosts remained. Not as the figures of the past, but as myths, legends, and whispers on the wind, tales of a lost civilization that once held the world in its grasp, and of the gods who abandoned them, leaving only their memories to haunt the earth. The air in Athens was heavy with dust and the weight of history. In the dim light of his study, the scholar sat surrounded by scrolls, his fingers brushing against the ancient writings of the past. Outside, the streets were bustling with the vibrancy of the city, but inside the scholar's small room, the world was quiet, consumed by the unraveling of mysteries long buried. His mind, like a labyrinth, was consumed by a question: what had truly happened to the Minoans? The legends, the myths, they were all he had to work with. But were they enough? Did they hold the truth, or were they distorted by the passage of time, shaped by the tongues of poets and the pens of storytellers? The Minoans were no longer a living civilization, but their echo still reverberated through the lands of Greece. The stories had been passed down, from the priestesses of Crete to the wandering bards of the mainland. Their rise, their fall, their gods, they had all become legends, the stuff of myth. The Minotaur, the labyrinth, the wrath of Poseidon. The gods themselves, angry and distant, punishing the Minoans for some forgotten sin. These stories were all that remained, swirling in the collective imagination of the Greek people. But the historian, this scholar, wanted more. He had no room for myth, he sought the truth. He spread out the maps before him, the scrolls filled with fragments of ancient records. He read, he analyzed, he thought. He knew that stories could be twisted, legends could be exaggerated, and facts could be lost in the haze of time. Yet, there had to be something beneath the stories, a kernel of truth, a foundation that could be uncovered. It was his job to find it. As he pored over the ancient texts, he found references to the Minoans in the writings of poets and philosophers. The famous tales of the labyrinth and the Minotaur were everywhere. But the stories always carried the same thread. The Minoans were a mighty civilization, proud and ambitious, but ultimately undone by their own hubris and the gods' fury. They had been destroyed by natural forces, by divine wrath, by their own arrogance. These were the legends that had survived, powerful, dramatic, and full of tragedy. But there was another side to the Minoans. In the ancient records, and the carefully scribbled notes of travelers and explorers, the scholar found something else, fragments of a people who were not just defined by their demise. They were artisans, builders, philosophers in their own right. Their frescoes depicted stories of joy, of life, of the sea and the sky. Their architecture was grand, their trade vast. They were not simply the subjects of myth, they were real people who had once walked the earth with ambition and vision. And yet, now they were nothing more than stories. The scholar began to piece together a new image of the Minoans, one that was not shaped by the myths, but by the evidence. He uncovered records of their trade with Egypt, their influence on the early Greek world. He studied their writing, an ancient script that was still undeciphered, and yet he could see the traces of it in the works of later cultures. The Minoans had left their mark on history, even if their civilization had crumbled into dust. But as the scholar traced the threads of the Minoan legacy, he was faced with the inevitable distortion of time. The myths had taken root, becoming more than just stories. They had transformed into something more, a reflection of the fears and hopes of the people who told them. The gods, once so close to the Minoans, had become vengeful and distant. The labyrinth had become a symbol of entrapment, and the Minotaur, a monstrous figure that haunted the minds of those who dared to imagine it. The truth had been blurred, buried beneath layers of myth and legend, until it was almost impossible to separate fact from fiction. The scholar knew that the Minoans' fall had not been a simple thing. It had not been just a single event, a volcanic eruption, a wave of destruction, a divine punishment. No, it was more complex than that. It was the collapse of a civilization, the end of an era. There were no simple answers, no clean resolutions. He found himself, at times, frustrated by the gaps in history, by the knowledge that some truths might never be known. The destruction of Crete, the fall of the Minoans, these things were lost to time, swallowed by the forces of nature and the tides of fate. All that remained were the stories, the echoes of a time long gone. Yet, the scholar could not help but be moved by the fragments of truth that remained. As he sifted through the records, as he looked at the artifacts, the ruins, he could almost feel the presence of the Minoans in the air. He could see their walls adorned with vibrant frescoes, hear the distant hum of their harbors filled with traders from across the Mediterranean. It was a civilization that had existed, that had lived and thrived, before it was lost to the winds of time. And so, the scholar continued his work, knowing that he could not restore the Minoans, could not bring them back. But perhaps, in his work, he could at least give them a place in the story of the world. A world that had moved on, but still whispered their name. And in those whispers, in those scattered fragments of their story, the Minoans would live on. Not as myths, not as monsters or gods, but as people. Real, flawed, beautiful people who had shaped the course of history, even in their destruction. The scholar sat back, the weight of the past pressing upon him. He had spent years trying to piece together the Minoan legacy, to separate truth from myth, to understand what had happened to a civilization that seemed to have vanished without a trace. And though he had uncovered much, he knew there would always be a part of the story that remained hidden. Some things, he thought, were meant to be lost. Some stories, once told, could never be retold. And in that silence, perhaps the Minoans would live on, forever remembered, forever lost. The earth trembled softly, a faint whisper beneath the feet of the archaeologists who stood at the edge of the excavation site. The sun beat down relentlessly, casting long shadows over the ruins of a once great civilization, now lying in pieces, silent, yet speaking in ways that no one could fully understand. The dust, rising from the ancient soil, swirled in the air as if disturbed by some unseen force, perhaps the same force that had once caused the Minoans to disappear. The archaeologists worked in silence, their brushes gently sweeping away centuries of dirt and debris. With each careful stroke, fragments of a forgotten world emerged, fragments that once told a story lost for so long. What had happened to the Minoans? What had happened to the civilization that had once flourished, only to be swallowed by the passage of time? New theories emerged with each passing day, each discovery. Some whispered that the gods had grown angry and turned their backs on the Minoans, others suggested that the earth itself had punished them for some ancient sin. There were those who believed that the civilization had simply faded away, overwhelmed by the unstoppable forces of nature or by the tides of human conflict. Yet, no one could say for certain. The truth was buried in the bones of the earth, hidden within the labyrinth of history. It was a puzzle, each piece offering a new hint, but none bringing a full picture. The bones of the Minoans seemed to rise from the earth once more. Amidst the ruins of palaces and temples, fragments of pottery and ancient tools told their own story. Yet it was the myths that continued to endure. They were more than just stories now, they were the heartbeat of a lost civilization. The Minotaur, the labyrinth, the wrath of the gods, these myths had survived across generations, passed from mouth to mouth, shaping the very fabric of the world that had come after. They lived on in the imagination, in the minds of those who heard them, as if the gods themselves had never truly abandoned the Minoans. Their stories were eternal, waiting to be remembered, waiting to rise again. The myths had become more than just explanations, they had become legends. And in these legends, the Minoans were not just a people of the past, they were a living memory. Their gods had not disappeared, as the world might have thought. The gods lived on in the tales, in the fragments of the past, in the very soil where the Minoans once stood. The gods had simply retreated, waiting for the world to be ready to remember them again. It was here, amidst the ruins, that the archaeologists began to understand something more. They were not just digging up bones and broken pots. They were digging up a story. A story that had never truly ended. A story that had been passed from generation to generation, from one culture to the next. The gods had never truly left, they had only been waiting. As they continued to unearth the ruins of Knossos and the other Minoan sites, the archaeologists uncovered more than just evidence of a lost civilization. They found signs of something deeper, something that transcended time and space. They found the symbols, the rituals, the language of a people who had believed in the power of the gods in a way that could never be fully understood. Somewhere deep within the bones of the earth, beneath the crumbled stone and shattered clay, the gods of the Minoans still lingered. They had not been forgotten, they had only been waiting for the right moment to return. And perhaps that moment had come. Perhaps the archaeologists, with their careful digging and their patient research, were the ones who had finally uncovered the key to unlocking the gods once more. The gods had not abandoned the Minoans after all. They had simply been hidden, waiting for the world to remember them. And now, in the quiet corners of forgotten ruins, those gods seemed to be returning. With every artifact unearthed, every stone moved aside, they were being remembered. The myths that had long been dismissed as mere stories were suddenly alive again, like old friends who had been lost in the shadows. And the gods, who had seemed so distant for so long, were returning with them. As the day wore on and the shadows grew longer, the archaeologists paused for a moment. The weight of the past was heavy in the air, and in that moment, they felt the presence of something ancient, something powerful. They looked at one another, silently acknowledging the strange connection they felt to the past, a connection that transcended time, that bridged the gap between the living and the dead. Perhaps it was the gods themselves, watching over the work of those who sought to uncover their story. Perhaps it was the spirit of the Minoans, living on in the ruins, in the myths, in the hearts of those who had not forgotten them. Or perhaps it was simply the realization that civilizations rise and fall, that empires are born and die, but the stories they leave behind are never truly gone. They are carried forward, from generation to generation, until they find new ears to listen to them. In the quiet of the evening, as the last light of day faded from the sky, the archaeologists packed up their tools, their minds filled with the weight of the past. They had unearthed only a small piece of the Minoan story, but in that piece, they had found something profound. The Minoans were gone, yes, but their gods, their myths, their stories would live on. They would be remembered, not as forgotten relics, but as legends. And somewhere, in the deep shadows of the earth, in the heart of the labyrinth, the gods were waiting. Waiting for the world to remember, to call them back into the light. They were not lost forever. They were just waiting for their time to return.